Okay, so looking at 4.1 patterns, let's start with a table of values. We all recognize that and we're familiar with that, and I like to abbreviate it, table of values. So if you ever see this written, you know that I'm talking about, sometimes we call it a T-chart or a table of values. They mean the same thing. And let's say we have 0, 1, 2, and 3 for my x values. Just to be clear, I can pick whatever I want for my x values. You can pick whatever you want, but we usually stick close to 0. Sometimes we go into the negatives as well, but let's say this is given to you here. And in your y values, let's say that you have 2, 4, 6, and 8. So we're going to start off nice and straightforward. And I want you to tell me if you know what common difference is. Do you remember that from last year? Or maybe you've never heard that before. Do you know what the word common difference means? Never heard of it? Good, that helps me to figure out where we're at. So I better teach you that. Common difference is looking at the y values and checking to see how much they go up by each time. You don't always have a common difference. Sometimes the difference changes from one term to the next. But in this case, what's it going up by each time? Plus 2. Do we all see that we're adding 2 each time if we look at it? So we're using that to come up with what the pattern is. So this plus 2, the one it's common because it's the same value each time, but that's what we would call the common difference. So far, so good? Okay, so then when we go to come up with an equation based on our patterns, we have stuff like this. N is a variable that I'm going to use often in this, and N is what we call the figure number. In this case, it would be x would be the same thing as n. I'll show you with some other examples that are coming up. T would be the term number. That also could go in place of the x. Right now, this isn't making any sense, so this isn't for this particular example. I'm just giving you some vocabulary or some background. And then we also would come up with a linear equation based on this stuff. So we would be taking a look at the pattern from the values that were given, and we would use that to come up with the linear equation using either n for the figure number or t for the term number. Hi. Yeah, no problem.
I want to use the loop.
Oh yeah, no problem.
Thanks. What are you guys working on? Patterns?
Patterns. We're gonna walk to the ball.
Nice. Yeah, nature.
Okay. Where were we? Okay, so let's take a look at an actual example. So let's say for our first example, I have a series of diagrams. So I have this one, and then I have this one, and then I have, you're already probably picking up on the pattern. The next one would look like this. So if you're given this and we want to come up with the pattern and the equation and everything relating to this, here's how we would go about this. First of all, we want to, in this example, use this figure number. So I'm going to put an n here, and I'll show you what I mean by this. In the first one with one circle, that would be the first figure. This one would be the second figure, the third figure, the fourth figure, and I'm going to put dot, dot, dot for both of these because this could keep going. And we could have like 100 of them, or we could have 150 or 75, doesn't matter. But we want to use the first few to help figure out the pattern so that even if I asked you about the 100th figure, you could figure it out without having to. Could you imagine sitting there and drawing out 100 circles with the 99 above, right? So we wouldn't want to do that. That's the purpose of equations. So let's take a look. If this was to keep going in the fifth figure, how many circles would be at the bottom? If we drew the fifth one. Yeah, 5. So you see the relationship between the figure number and the number of circles at the bottom, right? So let's take a look at how a table of values would go for this. So if we were to put this in a T-chart or a table of values, I would put my N value here. So I'm just taking that information that we have written there and I'm throwing it into a chart. And then here, this would be like my Y value, but to be clear, this would be the number of circles if we're putting it on a chart. So we wouldn't start with 0 because how could you have a 0th figure, right? So it's like natural numbers. We would start with the number 1. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And then help me to figure this out. In the first one, well, we can see it by looking at it. In figure number 2, we have 3. Figure number 3, we have 5. And without counting it, just by looking at the pattern in the chart, how many are there in the fourth one? 7. And if I were to go to 5, what would it be? So we see that pattern. What is the pattern, or what is it going up by each time? Plus 2 is our common difference, just to remind you. Good? Okay, so here's what we do with the common difference. In order to come up with an equation, we take our common difference and we always multiply that by the figure number. And then I'm going to put some dots here. We're not done with that. Sometimes we are, but usually we're not. So to check to see what I need to fill in where the dots are, I apply this to the first one. If I took 2 and multiplied it by this 1 here, I would end up with the number 2. But in my answer here, I have the number 1. What do I need to do in order to get to 1? I would add or subtract something. What would make the most sense? Minus 1. Let's test it and check. I didn't have to use the first one to test it. I could have, let's try it with this fifth one. So if I were to test it, I'm going to do that in a different color. So if I were to test it, I would say 2 times the fifth one would give me the number 10, but if I look here, it's 9. So yeah, this minus 1 really does work because 5 times 2 is 10, minus 1 is 9. So I can see that the formula works and I've gotten the correct answer. So let me repeat this and clarify because I know that this is new. We look at the chart or we look at the patterns up here and we find the common difference. Once we've found the common difference, we multiply that by the figure number, and then we know at the end here we're going to add or subtract something to get to the next term. So that's going to be different for each pattern that we're looking at. Are there any questions with that so far? Okay, so let's look at the second part of this. Let's say we want to know, I'm going to move this up and we can use this. We want to calculate the number of circles in figure 100. Can you think of a way for us to do that in a nice, easy, straightforward manner? And or go ahead and do that. I want you to find the number of circles in figure 100. And maybe you already know. If you want to call it out, you can. If you want to... Sure, yeah. 199. Everybody agree? Good. So here's our formula or our pattern that we came up with. So we would do 2 times, what is the 100? Which variable? Which variable would it be? 100 is the number, which n, right? So 100 is the n. So we would do 2 times 100 minus 1. So from that we get, this would be 200 minus 1. So we can see how we're getting 199 circles in figure 100. Good? How do we feel about that so far? Pretty okay? So we would be doing numbers 1 to 7, the odd letters, and number 10 for this section.